On September 10, 2020, a wooden crate creaked open on a hillside 190 kilometers north of Sydney, and something stepped onto Australian soil that had not touched the mainland in 3,000 years. Not a fossil, not a museum cast. A living, snarling 18-pound predator, blinking in daylight its species had not seen on this continent since before the pyramids of Giza were finished being built. For 3,000 years, something had been missing from Australia's forests, and nobody alive had ever actually seen what that absence had cost. In 2020, that changed, and what happened in the years after broke almost every prediction conservationists had quietly prepared themselves for. This is the story of the animal that disappeared, the disease that nearly finished the job a second time, and the night it finally came home. This is the story of how a species gone from an entire continent for 3 millennia was brought back in a single decade, why the scientists behind it were terrified it would fail, and what the devils did once they were finally free. Keep that image of the crate in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what a Tasmanian devil actually is, and what it used to do for a living. Forget the cartoon, forget the spinning tornado of teeth and dust. A Tasmanian devil is the world's largest surviving carnivorous marsupial, a low, muscular scavenger, built less like a predator and more like a cleanup crew. Its jaw can crush bone, its stomach can process a carcass down to fur and hoof, leaving almost nothing behind for disease to spread from. Picture a forest floor after a kangaroo dies of natural causes, out in the open, exposed to sun and flies and bacteria. Left alone, that carcass becomes a slow release of disease into the surrounding soil and water for weeks. A devil finds that same carcass within a night or two, and by morning there is almost nothing left behind to rot it all. For tens of thousands of years, devils moved across the Australian mainland, doing a job nobody else could do quite as efficiently. Patrolling the forest floor after dark, eating the dead before the dead could rot, and keeping smaller predators in check simply by being bigger, meaner, and more numerous than almost anything competing for the same scraps. A fox or a feral cat sharing territory with a healthy devil population does not thrive the way it does when the devils are gone. It hides more, hunts more cautiously, and raises fewer litters. Ecologists have a name for an animal that holds an ecosystem together this way, quietly, without anyone noticing until it disappears. They call it a keystone species. Removing a keystone does not just remove one animal. It changes the shape of everything the animal used to touch. And often nobody realizes how much shape has actually been lost until decades, or in this case millennia, later. Then, roughly 3,000 years ago, the shape of Australia changed. Dingoes arrived on the continent, most likely brought by seafaring traders from Asia, and they did something devils had never faced before. They hunted in coordinated packs. Imagine the shift from the devil's point of view. For tens of thousands of years, the biggest threat at any carcass was another devil, an animal it understood, an animal it had evolved alongside, an animal whose aggression followed rules devils already knew how to navigate. Then, within what is an evolutionary blink of an eye, an entirely new kind of competitor arrives, one that does not fight alone, one that can chase down live prey a solitary devil would never risk pursuing, one that simply does not play by the old rules. A devil is a formidable scavenger and a capable solitary hunter, but it is not built to compete with a pack animal for the same carcasses and the same territory, night after night, generation after generation. Slowly, and then not so slowly, the devils lost. They vanished from the eastern forests, they vanished from the deserts, they vanished from the entire Australian mainland, an area larger than the continental United States, until there was nowhere left for them to exist, except one place the dingoes never reached. An island at the bottom of the world, separated from the mainland by a churning, 240-kilometer stretch of open water called the Bass Strait, a body of water no dingo ever crossed. Tasmania became the last address on Earth for an animal that had once patrolled an entire continent. For 3,000 years that arrangement held. It was not thriving. It was surviving. Quietly. On an island refuge. The way a species does when it has been pushed to its very last option. And here is the uncomfortable truth about last options. They only work as long as nothing else goes wrong. In the mid-1990s, something else went wrong. A wildlife photographer working in northeastern Tasmania began noticing something disturbing on the faces of the devils she was documenting. Lumps, lesions, tumors, growing around the mouth and jaw, spreading fast, and killing the animal within months. At first, it looked like an isolated cluster, a strange local outbreak that would burn itself out. It did not burn itself out. Scientists eventually gave it a name, devil facial tumor disease, one of only a small handful of contagious cancers ever documented in any mammal on Earth. Most cancers die with the body they grow in. This one did not. Somewhere in its history, a single tumor cell mutated into something that could survive being transferred from one animal to another, effectively turning itself into an infectious parasite made of the devil's own tissue. It spreads the way almost nothing else does, through direct contact, through the exact kind of aggressive face-to-face biting that devils use to compete over food and mates. In other words, the disease weaponized the devil's own instincts against itself. The more devils behaved like devils, snapping and biting over a carcass the way their species had for tens of thousands of years, the faster it spread from jaw to jaw across the island. The numbers that followed are the kind conservationists still find difficult to say out loud. In parts of Tasmania, local devil populations collapsed by up to 90% within a matter of years. Fewer than 25,000 devils remained in the wild, scattered across the one island they had left, now being hunted by a disease with a near 100% mortality rate in the animals it infected. Let that sink in for a moment. An animal that had already been pushed off an entire continent, that had survived 3,000 years on a single island as its last refuge, was now watching that refuge turn against it from the inside, out of nowhere, for reasons nobody could have predicted or prevented. This was not a slow decline anyone could relax about and plan around over decades. This was a countdown, and everyone working with the species knew it. So a small group of Australian conservationists made a decision that, on paper, sounded almost impossibly ambitious. If Tasmania itself was no longer safe, the species needed a population somewhere the disease could not reach. And if the mainland was the one place devils had not existed in 3,000 years, then maybe, just maybe, the mainland was exactly where the insurance population needed to go. An organization called Aussie Ark took the lead. For more than a decade before that crate ever opened, their team built what they called an insurance population, healthy, disease-free devils, breeding carefully in managed sanctuaries, with every pairing selected specifically to avoid inbreeding and to maximize the genetic diversity of whatever population would eventually go free. It was slow, unglamorous, expensive work. Feeding animals, monitoring pouches, tracking bloodlines across generations of a species most Australians had never seen outside a wildlife park. Tim Faulkner, president of Aussie Ark, had spent more than 10 years with these animals by the time the release finally happened. And by his own account, nobody on the project was under any illusion about the risk. If the devils did not breed once they were free, if the mainland habitat could not support them, if predators or disease or simple bad luck intervened, there was no version of this plan that had a second chance built into it. And then, on that September morning in 2020, the waiting ended. Picture the scene. A nearly 1,000-acre wildlife sanctuary at Barrington Tops, New South Wales, fenced against foxes and feral cats, but otherwise as close to open, unmanaged bushland as the team could engineer. Tall eucalypt forest rising on every side, the air thick with the smell of wet bark after an overnight rain. 11 devils, each one carried in individual white crates, each one selected years in advance for exactly this moment, based on bloodlines mapped carefully enough to avoid inbreeding in the generations still to come. Rangers knelt in the grass beside the crates, cameras rolled. Nobody in that clearing was pretending this was routine. Liz Gabriel, director of conservation at Aussie Ark, would later describe watching the release as one of the most emotional moments of her career, a moment 3,000 years in the making, compressed into a single afternoon. Among the crowd helping with the release were actors Chris Hemsworth and his wife Elsa Pataki, longtime supporters of the project, who personally released two of the animals, a female named Lisa and a male named Lenny, names that would matter again later in this story. This release followed an earlier, smaller assisted trial release of 15 animals months before, which meant that by the end of that day, 26 Tasmanian devils were, for the first time in 3,000 years, living wild and free on the Australian mainland. But here is what makes this release different from a simple reintroduction story. The devils were not sent home alone. Alongside them, conservationists released 6 other native mammal species into the same sanctuary: eastern quolls, brush-tailed rock wallabies, rufous betongs, long-nosed potaroos, Parma wallabies, and southern brown bandicoots, animals that had also been hammered by feral predators for over a century. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Foxes and feral cats do not like sharing territory with Tasmanian devils. Bring the devils back, and the smaller, more vulnerable mammals get a bodyguard that costs the conservation project nothing extra to maintain. It was not just a devil release. It was an attempt to rebuild an entire missing layer of the food web in a single afternoon. If you are enjoying stories like this one, where a species gets pulled back from the edge and an entire ecosystem starts rebuilding itself around it, this channel exists specifically to find and tell these stories. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps more people find work like this. Now, back to the devils. For the first several months after the release, the honest answer is that nobody knew what was going to happen. The team monitored the sanctuary constantly, checking camera traps, tracking radio collars, inspecting pouches during routine health checks, watching for any sign that the animals were adapting to a landscape their species had not touched in 3 millennia. And then, in May of 2021, less than a year after that first crate opened, Aussie Ark announced something that made headlines around the world. Rangers performing a routine pouch check found joeys. 7 of them, tiny, pink, barely developed, tucked safely inside the pouches of the released females. For the first time in more than 3,000 years, Tasmanian devils had been born in the wild on the Australian mainland. Not born in a breeding facility, not born behind a fence built specifically for reproduction. Born the way devils were meant to be born. In the wild, on the land their ancestors had been forced off of before recorded history began in most of the world. Here is the number that should stop you for a second. 3,000 years is longer than the entire written history of most modern nations. It predates the founding of Rome. It predates the reign of most pharaohs anyone has heard of. And it took less than 1 year of freedom for the devils to close that gap. The story did not stop there, and this is where the data starts doing something researchers were quietly hoping for, but had not dared to promise. In 2023, 3 years after the original release, one of the very first devils ever freed at Barrington Tops, the same female named Lisa that Chris Hemsworth had personally carried out of her crate, gave birth to 3 more joeys in the wild. By that point, the project had expanded well beyond the original 26 animals. An additional 21 adult devils had been released into the sanctuary, and 16 joeys total had been born wild on the mainland since the very first release. The population was not just surviving, it was compounding, generation folding into generation, in a landscape that had gone without a single Tasmanian devil for 3,000 years. Conservationists working on the project have openly compared what happened at Barrington Tops to one of the most famous rewilding stories in the world, the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s, an event that reshaped rivers, forests, and entire animal populations across an American national park simply by putting one missing predator back where it belonged. In Yellowstone, wolves returning changed where elk chose to graze, which changed which trees along the riverbanks were allowed to grow, which changed erosion patterns along the water itself. A cascade of consequences nobody fully predicted from a single reintroduction. The devils were being asked to do something similar for Australia, a country that currently holds the unfortunate distinction of having the worst mammal extinction rate on the entire planet, having already lost more native mammal species to extinction than almost anywhere else on Earth since European colonization began. If a keystone predator returning to an American national park could change the course of rivers within a few decades, what could 3,000 years of missing predation pressure returning to Australian bushland actually do, given enough uninterrupted time to work? But before we get carried away with the triumph of it all, we need to sit with the harder, more honest part of this story, because that is the part that separates a genuine conservation success from a feel-good headline that quietly falls apart under scrutiny. The Barrington Tops Sanctuary, for all its size, nearly 1,000 acres, is still fenced. It is still a managed, predator-controlled environment specifically designed to keep foxes and feral cats out. That is not a small caveat. It means the devils living there today are not yet facing the unmanaged, open mainland the way their ancestors once did, 3,000 years before dingoes ever arrived. The genuine, unfenced return of Tasmanian devils to the wild forests of eastern Australia, roaming freely the way Aussie Arc's own leadership has said they hope to see within the next century, remains a future goal, not a present reality. And back in Tasmania itself, the island that has been the species' only home for 3 millennia, devil facial tumor disease has not disappeared. It continues to threaten wild populations there, which is exactly why a disease-free mainland insurance population matters so much in the first place. This project did not solve the crisis facing Tasmanian devils. It bought the species something far more valuable than a solution. It bought time, and it bought a second location where the entire species cannot be wiped out by a single outbreak. There is also a harder question sitting underneath all of this, one that conservationists themselves have raised. Dingoes are still out there, across most of mainland Australia, the very predators whose arrival pushed devils off the continent 3,000 years ago in the first place. If devils are ever released beyond fenced sanctuaries into the wider, unmanaged mainland, will 3,000 years of separation mean they have to relearn how to survive alongside an animal their ancestors were once driven out by, using instincts that have not had to account for a pack predator in over 100 generations? Nobody currently knows the answer. There is no fenced trial that can fully simulate what happens the first time a wild dingo pack encounters a devil population that has never had to think about dingoes at all. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story, and it is not something this video is going to pretend away for the sake of a tidier ending. It is simply where the story currently stands, unfinished. The way most real conservation stories actually are. More open question than closed chapter. And that brings us back to the wider picture. Because Barrington Tops was never meant to be the ending. Aussie Arc's leadership has been explicit about the scale of their ambition, describing this reintroduction as the first step in an effort that could, over the coming century, see devils living throughout the great eastern forests of Australia the way they did 3,000 years ago, before dingoes ever set foot on the continent. That is not a promise anyone can guarantee. It is a direction, a trajectory the data from the last several years has started to support. Joey by joey, litter by litter, one fenced sanctuary at a time. So here is what this story actually reveals, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. It reveals that an extinction 3,000 years in the making is not automatically permanent, that the word extinct, when it is a regional extinction rather than a global one, can sometimes still be reversed by patient, unglamorous, decade-long work that almost nobody outside conservation circles ever hears about. It reveals that a keystone species removed from a landscape leaves a hole shaped exactly like itself, a hole that foxes and feral cats had been filling with predation nobody wanted for 3,000 years, until something finally moved back in to fill it properly. And it reveals that recovery, real recovery, is never a single triumphant afternoon. It is a crate opening in 2020, followed by a pouch check in 2021, followed by 3 more Joeys in 2023, followed by years of monitoring nobody will ever put in a highlight reel, each one quietly proving the last prediction wrong. Picture that crate again, the one from the very beginning of this video, creaking open on a New South Wales hillside in September of 2020. A wooden box, a nervous conservation team, and an animal stepping out into daylight its entire lineage had been locked out of for 3,000 years. Nobody watching that moment could have promised what would happen next. Nobody could have guaranteed the Joeys, or Lisa's return 3 years later, or the 16 births that followed. All anyone could do was open the crate and trust 3,000 years of missing ecology to start rebuilding itself. One devil at a time, one pouch check at a time, one unremarkable Tuesday morning at a time, until enough of those mornings had passed that something genuinely historic had quietly happened without most of the world ever noticing. So here is the question I want you to actually sit with before you go. Is it more remarkable that a species can vanish from an entire continent for 3,000 years and still come back? That a contagious cancer nearly finished the job a second time before anyone could stop it? Or that it took less than 12 months of freedom for the devils to prove every cautious prediction wrong? Tell me which one stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if stories like this one, the ones about what gets lost and what still manages to come back, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because we are only getting started.